Okay, well, thank you, Jerry, and I'm very happy to be with you tonight. Usually I do webinars where I'm not able to see people, so now I could see some people who have tuned into my lectures like Ann Hazen and Dick Notabart and Roger Schenkel. So this is a good opportunity for me. So Jerry asked me to do a presentation on the war in Ukraine, which is obviously ongoing, and it has filled our newspapers and news shows. It is the largest ground war in Europe since the end of the Second World War, and it's been grinding on now for almost 2 weeks. And so as we meet tonight, the situation remains precarious for Ukraine and really for the world. And there's no guarantee that the conflict will not spill over into neighboring states, some of which are members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so the world is really tottering on the possibility of nuclear war for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So how did we get to this point? And that is the purpose of this lecture, which will analyze the roots of the conflict. It will offer perspectives on the crisis from both the Russian and Ukrainian points of view, and we will discuss what is at stake for the United States in this ongoing catastrophe. So specifically, the following questions will be addressed. Are Russians and Ukrainians separate people, or are they one people? What does all of this look like from Putin's perspective? What is Putin up to? What are his objectives? And why now? Why has Russia decided to invade now and not earlier or in the future? And finally, what are American interests in the crisis? But before we begin, it's necessary to understand the geopolitical context. The country of Ukraine is a nation of 44 million people. It is the second largest country in Europe, second only to Russia itself. It doesn't have any prominent natural borders. And so the name Ukraine itself means borderland or frontier. And because it has no natural obstacles to invasion, it has been repeatedly invaded throughout history by Vikings, by Mongols, Lithuanians, Poles, Russians, Swedes, and of course in World War II by Nazi Germany. But Ukraine has been an independent nation since 1991. And as recently as 1994, it was the third largest nuclear power in the world. And today, it has the second largest military force in Europe. The crux of the present crisis is that Vladimir Putin claims that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and that Ukraine itself is not a nation, but rather it's part of Russia. He argues that Ukrainians and Russians share a common identity, and thus he regards Western influence in Ukraine as an existential threat to Russia. So is Putin correct? Are Russians and Ukrainians one people, or are they separate nations, as Ukraine insists? So to answer this, we have to examine the history of Russian-Ukrainian relations. We go back to the 9th century, when Vikings established control over Kiev, which was a Slavic city along the Dnieper River. Now, natives along that river called the Vikings the Rus, R-U-S. That's a Slavic word given to describe the red-haired Scandinavians. And so the land of the Rus would eventually be known as Russia. By the 11th century, Kievian Rus was geographically the largest state in Europe. But by the late 15th century, Moscow replaced Kiev as the most prominent Eastern Slavic city, and Moscow became the nucleus of a new empire. Meanwhile, Kiev came under the control of the Polish-Lithuanian state. And the name Ukraine did not appear in historical documents until the 12th century. It appeared on history maps by the 16th century. The Ukrainian language absorbed influences from its surrounding neighbors. So Ukrainian as a language has Polish, Turkic, and other European elements in it. In the 16th century, major swaths of the country, as I mentioned, came under the control of Poland and Lithuania. Then on January 30th, 1667, a truce ended a 13-year war between Poland and Russia. Now, I'm sorry that this map is so blurred, but it was the only copy I could find. On January 30th, 1667, the Truce of Andrusova divided the lands of Ukraine. And so Russia took this part shaded in green, and Poland, Lithuania took the part shaded in pink. And Putin often refers to the Truce of Andrusova of 1667 to demonstrate that Ukraine has always been Russian. Now, I would imagine that most of you, if not all of you, never heard of the Truce of Andrusova. I certainly didn't before I did research into this. But to Putin, this is the crucial historical event that supports his claim that Ukraine has always been part of Russia. The city of Kiev, which unfortunately is blurred on this map, but that was also part of the Ukraine that was taken over by Russia. And so the ethnic divisions from this truce remain today. And as a result, oops, sorry about that. As a result, people living in the eastern part of Ukraine remain primarily Russian, and also in the southern part of Ukraine, whereas people living in the western part of Ukraine have strongly Polish influences. Now, starting in the middle of the 17th century, Russia began to expand further southward. In 1783, Catherine the Great annexed the Crimean Peninsula. So this is a map showing Russian expansion under Catherine the Great. And she acquired this part in sort of maroon from taking over that part of Poland, and this part in dark brown taking over from what was left of Ukraine. In the 18th and early 19th century, Ukrainians and Russians both contributed to a common culture, sort of like the way the English and Scottish did to British culture. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution broke out, and Ukrainians rose up in a bid to declare independence, but they were quickly defeated. By 1922, the Soviet Union was established, and Ukraine became one of 15 republics that made up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
Take care of yourself. I just remember.
Okay. So what you see on this map are the 15 republics of the USSR. In the 1930s, Stalin called for the collectivization of agriculture. What that meant was that the state would seize private lands and use the crops grown on that land for the purposes of creating capital to industrialize. Well, the Ukraine grew 90% of the wheat in the USSR, and many prosperous peasants, known as kulaks, resisted Stalin's order for collectivization. They refused to turn the land and their crops and livestock over to the state. And Soviet troops then seized the grain, and they closed off territories where resistance arose. And then the Soviet state imposed on Ukraine a man-made famine. This was in 1932, 1933. Kulaks were killed, deported, or sent into forced labor. As a result of the killings and forced famine, somewhere between 3 and 6 million Ukrainians died in what has been called a genocide. The Great Famine of 1932-1933 is known in Ukrainian as the Holodomor, which means extermination by hunger. And it is etched into the Ukrainian consciousness today, much like the Holocaust is for Jews.
Yes.
So this is just one of the historic reasons that helps explain why Ukrainian nationalism is in many ways anti-Russian. During World War II, Ukraine lost another 5 to 7 million as a result of the German invasion and occupation, although some Ukrainians collaborated in the killing of some 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews. Now, as I mentioned, the Crimean Peninsula was annexed to the Russian Empire in 1783 by Catherine the Great. But in 1954, then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev transferred the Crimea back to the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. He did it to firm up support in his power struggle with other Soviet leaders in 1954. And so the Crimean Peninsula returned to Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union. Just before the USSR dissolved in 1991, the Ukrainian parliament declared independence from the Soviet Union. And Ukraine has been an independent nation ever since August 24th, 1991. At the time of their independence, Ukraine was left with the world's third largest nuclear stockpile. Then in 1994, Ukraine signed a treaty with Russia. It was called the Treaty of Budapest, in which Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for a Russian commitment to respect the independence and sovereignty and existing borders of Ukraine. So here Ukraine had this enormous arsenal of nuclear weapons, and it relinquished them in exchange for a Russian promise never to invade Ukraine. In the 2004 presidential elections in Ukraine, the pro-Western candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, lost in an election that was marked by fraud. Yushchenko was eventually named president after street demonstrations. Sorry, let me go back to this. There were street demonstrations in what was called the Orange Revolution in 2004. And so the pro-Western Yushchenko was restored to power. So this Orange Revolution represented a seismic shift westward in the geopolitics of Ukraine. Clearly, the people of the Ukraine wanted a pro-Western leader rather than a pro-Russian leader. Putin then denounced the West for trying to exert undue influence on Ukraine. Russia became particularly alarmed when NATO indicated it wanted to invite Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance. President George W. Bush supported Ukraine's membership in NATO, but France and Germany opposed it because they didn't want to provoke Russia. NATO then responded with a compromise. It was called the Bucharest Agreement. And the compromise was that it promised that Ukraine will one day be a member of the alliance, but it did not put it on a specific path as to when or how it would do so. Then in 2013, protests broke out after then President Viktor Yanukovych struck a deal with Putin to turn Ukraine away from the West to accept an economic arrangement with Russia. Now, that was very unpopular with the Ukrainian people. A majority of the people wanted an economic relationship with the European Union, not with Putin's Russia. And so once again, the people went out to demonstrate. More than 100 people were killed in those street demonstrations, but ultimately they forced Yanukovych to flee to Russia. And he was replaced by a pro-Western government, which Putin branded illegitimate. In 2014, clashes broke out in the Crimea when Russian supporters endorsed Russia to annex Crimea. And so those rebels were armed with Russian-supplied equipment. They were backed by Russian soldiers. And so within weeks, Russia annexed Crimea. A public referendum followed with 97% of residents voting in favor of secession, although those results have been disputed. But the fact is that most of the people living in Crimea were ethnic Russians. It remains the only time that a European nation's borders has been changed by military force since World War II. Now, the United States and much of Europe denounced that development, and they imposed economic sanctions against Moscow for annexing Crimea. In fact, Russia was expelled from the Group of Eight, an organization of the world's most developed economies. And in that same year of 2014, fighting broke out in eastern Ukraine, in this area shaded in red. And that was another region with significant ethnic Russian population. Again, this goes back to that Treaty of Andrusova, where Russia took the eastern part of Ukraine. And so many ethnic Russians live in the eastern part. And so pro-Russian forces in that area shaded in red have demanded union with Russia. The fighting is continuing between ethnic Russians, supported by men in arms from Russia, against government forces of Ukraine. And some 14,000 have died in the fighting. And again, this fighting broke out in 2014, and it is going on even today. Now, these ethnic Russians are separatists. That is, they want to separate from Ukraine and join Russia. And the area that they control is called the Donbas. In 2015, European leaders reached an agreement called the Minsk Accords, which granted ethnic Russians limited autonomy in the eastern part of the Donbas. So, to return to the question, are Ukrainians and Russians one people, as Putin claims? Well, certainly many Ukrainian citizens are ethnic Russians, and those living in southern and eastern parts of the country largely speak Russian as their native language. And it is true that Russians and Ukrainians have been tied together historically and culturally to a degree. Ukrainians lived under Russian control for more than 200 years. And there's a cultural affinity based on language as well as on the Orthodox faith. But as far as most Ukrainians are concerned, they have developed an identity and a national consciousness that is distinct and apart from Russia. In 2019, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church separated from the Russian Orthodox Church. Aside from the ethnic Russians in the East and the South, most Ukrainians have turned their backs on Russia. Young Ukrainians are choosing to learn German or Polish rather than Russian, and of course, English. There have not been any direct flights between Russia and Ukraine in the past 7 years. Whereas until the recent war, you could get a bus ticket from Kiev to Poland for just $20. So increasingly, Ukraine was tying itself to the West. And many Ukrainians resented that even before the Russian invasion, 7% of Ukraine's territory was under Russian control. That 7% was Crimea and the Donbass. So we've looked at this history from the Ukrainian perspective, but how do things look from the Russian point of view? Fear of the West has been a constant factor throughout Russian and Soviet history. And that fear is for good reason. Russia, the largest country in the world, has no natural barriers on its western border. The land on the western part of Russia is very flat. And as a result, Russia has been invaded from the West time and time again in modern history. In 1700, Sweden was a European power, and it invaded Russia. In 1812, Napoleonic France invaded Russia from the West. In 1914, Germany did the same. Poland, when it became recreated as a nation after World War I, invaded the Soviet Union. And in 1941, Nazi Germany invaded Russia. And so, because of these repeated invasions from the West, Russia has always had a fear of Western influences. And the Soviet Union and the West were enemies during the Cold War. But when communism came to an end in 1991, you may remember there were great expectations for a true partnership between the United States and Russia. But unfortunately, that partnership never materialized. After the dissolution of the USSR, the United States tended to treat Russia as a defeated nation. When Putin became president in 2000, Russia was suffering from an identity crisis. It was a humbled former superpower that was neither the prosperous capitalist democracy it hoped for, nor was it the powerful empire of the Soviet era. And from Putin's perspective, the collapse of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. When he became president, he immediately promised to restore Russia's great power status after a decade of humiliating post-Soviet poverty and corruption. That was in the 1990s. Now, Putin is particularly concerned over the expansion of NATO eastward. If we go back to 1949, when NATO was first established, it was a military alliance directed against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had expanded into Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. And so NATO was formed to counterbalance Soviet expansion. And many of those nations who joined NATO in 1949, the nations you see here in blue, did so in order to protect against any future aggression coming from Russia. Putin, and many other Russians for that matter, question why is it that NATO wasn't dissolved after the collapse of the Soviet Union? I mean, after all, if NATO was formed as an anti-Soviet bloc, why did it still exist after the Soviet Union disappeared? Early in his presidency, Putin hinted that even Russia would like to join NATO, but nothing ever came of that. Now, in 1990, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, talks were proceeding about the pending unification of Germany. You may remember after World War II, Germany was divided between East and West, the eastern part being communist. And the Soviets in 1990 could have prevented a unification of Germany. So in order to get the Soviets to agree to German unification, US Secretary of State James Baker on the left assured Mikhail Gorbachev on the right that not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastern direction. So that was the assurance that Baker gave Gorbachev to get Gorbachev to agree to the unification of Germany. Today, the United States claims that that 1-inch eastward pledge was just a proposal made by Baker, that there was no formal agreement not to expand NATO eastwards. Nevertheless, Putin claims that adding Central and Eastern European nations to NATO in 1999 and afterwards was a violation and a betrayal of Baker's pledge. And it's a provocation to Russia. Since 1999, 14 nations in Eastern Europe have joined NATO. All of these countries in yellow and light green. And all of them were formerly part of the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. And so Putin concludes that NATO's expansion is directed at containing Russia. And therefore, he views NATO as an acute threat to Russia's national security. Russia became further alarmed when George W. Bush announced plans to set up military defense systems in Poland and the Czech Republic on Russia's western border. Here, Poland and Czech Republic. Bush explained that the missiles would be pointed at Iran rather than Russia, but that did little to reassure Putin. In 2007, at the Munich Conference on Security Policy, Putin declared that Russia would not accept any further expansion of NATO. Despite that, the next year, then President Bush pushed for Ukraine and Georgia to be able to join NATO. But France and Germany pushed back. And so NATO then promised that Ukraine and Georgia would one day become part of the alliance, but they didn't lay out any sort of path on how that would happen. This was known as the Bucharest Agreement. Some also refer to it as the open door. In other words, a door was left open for Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO, but there were no specifics as to when and how that would happen. NATO continues to take the position that any nation is free to request membership. But Putin insists that Ukraine must put it in writing that it will never join NATO. But even then, Putin sees the West turning Ukraine into a pro-American liberal-style democracy. And from his perspective, that is a threat to Russia. And then this past November, just about 5 months ago, the United States and Ukraine signed a charter on strategic partnership, which stated that the United States supports Ukraine's right to join NATO. Apparently, this was done with little thought on how Russia might react. And so the very next month, Putin demanded that the West pledge that Ukraine will never be part of NATO. Not only that, but that NATO should roll back from Eastern Europe. That is, all those countries that joined NATO from 1999 on should no longer be allowed to be part of NATO. In Putin's speeches, he specifically refers to the territory of the former Russian Empire, which he laments losing. He may be referring to restoring the former Soviet Union, but more likely, what Putin would like to do is to restore the empire of 18th century Imperial Russia. He would like to regather all Russian speakers scattered in different places and put them under the control of Moscow. Now, he may not be thinking of conquering those lands, but he may want to make sure that their leaders are completely dependent on Moscow, the way Belarus is today. Putin often deflects criticism by using a whataboutism defense. And so when he's confronted about expanding Russian power, he justifies Russia's behavior by condemning what he sees as similar behavior on the part of the United States. So, for example, when the invasion of Ukraine is brought up, Putin cites that America invaded Iraq in 2003. Putin defends Russia's right to dominate countries in its backyard by claiming that the United States has done the same with the Monroe Doctrine, dominating countries in the Western Hemisphere. So, what is Putin really up to? President Biden is not eager to include Ukraine in NATO. After 2 decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States has no appetite for further military commitments. Nevertheless, Biden refuses to give in to Putin's demand that the West put in writing that Ukraine will never be part of NATO. Washington maintains that every nation is sovereign and that every nation should be allowed to decide its own security needs. But Putin insists on a concept of indivisible security, meaning that you cannot separate the security of one nation without considering its impact on other countries. But Putin knows that Ukraine will not be admitted to NATO because in order to do so, it requires the approval of all 30 member nations of NATO. And Germany and France have clearly stated that they will block Ukraine's entrance into NATO. But as we have seen year by year, Moscow has been losing political influence in Ukraine. And at the same time, Kiev has expanded its security cooperation with the United States and with Western Europe. Now, there's considerable corruption in the government in Ukraine. Nevertheless, it stands as a free market democracy. And as such, it's an embarrassment for the authoritarian regime of Putin. And Putin cannot tolerate a Western-oriented Ukraine in its own backyard. He has already managed to turn Belarus into a puppet state, and he would love to do the same with Ukraine, Georgia, and Kazakhstan, countries which Putin believes are situated in Russia's sphere of influence. But his entire pretext for invading Ukraine is completely flimsy. It's almost nonsensical. He says that Ukraine is committing genocide against ethnic Russians in the Donbas region. He says that the government of Ukraine is under the command of a bunch of drug-addicted Nazi fascists, even though the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish. And so it seems likely that Putin is using the issue of Ukrainian membership in NATO just as an excuse to distract from his real motive, which is to create a greater Russia, to expand Russian territory. He would also like to achieve what previous Russian leaders failed to do. He would like to gain a veto over NATO membership. He would like to be able to say which nations can and cannot be part of NATO. And he hopes that the war will divide the Western alliance. But Germany and Turkey which in the past were reluctant to confront Russia, they now support measures to bolster Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion. In fact, German Chancellor Scholz reversed decades of German foreign policy by doubling the defense budget and by supplying arms to Ukraine. Putin also hoped to use the crisis to get the West to discuss issues concerning overall European security, issues that the West previously declined to consider, such as limiting NATO military exercises on Russia's border and halting the development of intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Putin might be intending to conquer the entire Ukraine, but a military occupation of Europe's second-largest country might be beyond the capabilities of the Russian army. Putin might intend to lop off part of the Ukraine, the way he did with Crimea. More likely, I think, Putin's war is to bring about regime change, to ensure that Ukraine will have a more Russia-friendly government along the lines of the Lukashenko government in Belarus. And that would mean toppling the Zelensky government. As a former KGB officer, Putin is both shrewd and unscrupulous. One of his historical role models is Alexander III, a reactionary czar who was ruthless against his internal and external enemies. Putin has declared that liberal democracies are today obsolete. He has consolidated power by imprisoning and sometimes murdering his political opponents. Also, he has done the same to activists and journalists. He branded liberal media outlets as foreign agents. He's particularly effective in exploiting the vulnerabilities and mistakes of his opponents, such as Europe's dependence on Russia's natural gas and destabilizing democratic governments in the West and capitalizing on then President Trump's fragile ego. But while his policy towards Ukraine promises some benefits, as far as he's concerned, but I would argue that his policy towards Ukraine carries more risks than benefits. And so, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the West has imposed punishing sanctions, which in the long run might very well cripple the Russian economy. The Russian currency, the ruble, nosedived by about 30% against the dollar. The ruble is now worth less than 1 US penny. And interest rates in Russia are up some 20%. Air travel has been shut off, and inflation grows each passing day. The war has also united democratic nations in ways that Putin never anticipated. Even traditionally neutral Switzerland has announced it is freezing Russian assets. And non-NATO countries such as Japan and Australia and Taiwan have supported sanctions as well. And because of the war, Germany has refused to certify the Nord Stream 2 gas pipe. And Sweden and Finland are now considering joining NATO. The war has brought more NATO troops to countries bordering Russia, to Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. The United States has provided lethal military assistance, and other NATO countries have done so as well, including Germany. Public opinion polls show that Ukrainians are more determined to join NATO now than before the crisis. Today, some 55% of the population want NATO membership, as compared to just 38% in 2014. So these are the very outcomes that Putin had been trying to prevent, but that he caused as a result of his invasion of Ukraine. And so, in many ways, Putin's strategy has backfired. It has brought about the very circumstances he had hoped to avoid. Instead of weaning Ukraine away from the West, it has drawn that nation closer to the West. And there are fears that he might try to conquer additional territory beyond Ukraine. but it's unlikely that he will try to take over East European states that are now members of NATO. To subjugate countries like Ukraine and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would require a massive army, and that would require an economic foundation that contemporary Russia does not come close to having. Now, there's been an ongoing debate over Putin's mental state. Some observers say that the Russian leader is ailing, that his face seems puffy, and that he seems stiff when he walks. They conclude that Putin might be on steroids or other drugs that might be impairing his judgment. Some say that he has been isolated since the COVID pandemic and that he has surrounded himself with yes men, which has prevented him from realizing the consequences of his actions. A recent article in Time magazine speculates that Putin is afraid of dying and that he has attacked Ukraine as a way of postponing his own demise, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But now, we may never know the inner workings of Putin's mind, but what does seem apparent is that he is determined to win in Ukraine, no matter what the cost. So what is at stake for the United States in this crisis? Well, America has no treaty obligation to defend Ukraine. And President Biden has made it clear that he will not send American forces to defend that besieged nation. But the survival of an independent, democratic Ukraine is most definitely in the interests of the United States. After World War II, the United States was instrumental in creating a world order backed by NATO and the United Nations, which asserted the right that every nation has to its independence and sovereignty. It was a world order dedicated to prevent aggression of powerful nations against smaller and weaker states. In other words, a world order that was determined not to repeat the international anarchy that existed from 1914 to 1945, an international anarchy that resulted in 2 world wars and the death of tens of millions. And since 1945, that liberal world order has prevailed. It has prevented large-scale wars in Europe and in the world as a whole. The Russian invasion of Ukraine represents a direct challenge to that system in place since 1945. And it could once again make it acceptable for powerful nations to take over weaker ones. And that is what the United States and the Western powers want to prevent. And it should also be kept in mind that there is much more at stake than just Ukraine. China is watching how the crisis is unfolding, with Taiwan in mind. Particularly after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, China, Russia, and other authoritarian states question whether Washington has the resolve to defend democratic states, to deter aggression. So when we ask, what's at stake for us in this crisis, I think Russia expert Fiona Hill put it best when she said, excuse me, when Fiona Hill said, quote, "Ukraine has become the front line in a struggle not just between democracies and autocracies, but in a struggle for maintaining a rules-based system in which the things that countries want are not taken by force." So now I'd like to raise the question, why did Putin decide to invade Ukraine now? After all, Ukraine has expressed interest in NATO for the past 7 years. So why is Putin fomenting this crisis now? And I would suggest there are various possible explanations. Last year, 2021, marked the 30th anniversary of both the fall of the Soviet Union and the emergence of Ukraine as an independent nation. And so Putin may want to mark that anniversary with a show of military force for domestic consumption. Also, Putin turns 70 this year, and he may be concerned with his legacy. He would like to recover Ukraine as part of his agenda to restore the power of the old Soviet Union. Putin seeks regime change in Ukraine, and it seems that the moment to strike is now, because the Ukraine has been moving closer and closer to the West than at any time before. Also, to Putin, Western nations seemed more divided than in previous years, with a new government in Germany, with growing disapproval of Boris Johnson in Britain, with Poland and Hungary at odds with the European Union, and with France having an election coming up next month. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan seemed to show American weakness. And in addition, Putin would also like to have a big victory before his 2024 election comes up. But I would argue that Putin has badly miscalculated in this crisis. He miscalculated in thinking that most Ukrainians oppose Western influence, that they would support the Russian incursion. He thought that Russian soldiers would be welcomed as liberators by most Ukrainians. He never anticipated the furious opposition that Ukrainians are putting up against the Russian incursion. Russia has been overly optimistic over what the use of military force can achieve in Ukraine. The Russian military possesses a preponderance of force compared to the military of Ukraine, but the march towards Kiev has stalled. Tanks and artillery have bogged down. The Russian military effort will most likely succeed over time, but the expected early victory has not materialized. But even if Zelensky's government is overthrown, Ukrainians will very well wage a guerrilla resistance, similar to what the Soviet Union faced in Afghanistan. Putin also miscalculated by believing that Russia could easily sustain the effects of sanctions. He had a war chest of some $620 billion, but those sanctions have now prevented him from spending most of that. The economic pressure against Russia appears to be highly effective. It has impeded all business transactions with Russia. Now, is there a diplomatic solution to ending this war? I would suggest that even if Ukraine agrees to recognize Russia's sovereignty over Crimea, even if Ukraine agrees to give over the Donbass to Russia, and even if Ukraine guarantees Russia it will never join NATO, I don't think that would be enough for Putin. But for Ukrainians, the issue is far beyond NATO at this point. A majority of them want integration with Western institutions, not just military integration, but also membership in the European Union. So any declaration of Ukrainian neutrality in the crisis does not appear likely. Russian officials have made clear that they see no point in negotiating with Zelensky, and they've worked to actively delegitimize his administration. So in my opinion, Russia has a lot more to lose than to gain in this war with Ukraine, but that is obviously not the way Putin sees it. But I do think that the West does bear some responsibility in this crisis. In retrospect, NATO expansion to the borders of Russia may very well have been a mistake. In fact, at the time, in the late 1990s, two foremost experts argued against expanding NATO eastward. George F. Kennan was the dean of America's Russia's experts. And in 1997, he said that the expansion of NATO eastward was, quote, the most fatal era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. And Henry Kissinger also warned about the dangers of NATO expansion eastward. And that declaration made in November of 2021 by the United States that Ukraine could join NATO, I think that was an unnecessary provocation to Russia. But in no way should any of that excuse Putin's reckless decision to wage barbaric war against a nation that really did not do anything to warrant such an attack. And the current situation is particularly perilous because there are few checks and balances around Putin. Now, what are some of the possible outcomes of this war? Well, hopefully the sanctions against Russian oligarchs will then turn them against Putin. But short of Putin being ousted by the oligarchs or being ousted by a popular uprising, both highly unlikely at this time, it seems that Putin is determined to destroy the present government in Kiev. And the wider danger is that conflict can spill over to NATO countries in Eastern Europe. The United States is encouraging Poland to give Ukraine old Soviet MiG fighters, which Ukrainian pilots know how to fly. And if that happened, Putin may try to punish Poland. And that would trigger Article 5, which would bring into the conflict all 30 NATO countries. Now, just today, Poland said it would not send those MiG fighter airplanes directly to Ukraine, but would send them to Germany, and the United States would then send them to Ukraine. But the United States has refused to do so. Now, the most positive scenario is that Putin could stop the war right now and consolidate the gains that the Russian military has made. But none of these outcomes seem very likely at this moment. I would like to close by focusing in on the broader implications for world politics and for US diplomacy. China's relations with Russia have been strengthened throughout the crisis, although China's President Xi might be having second thoughts about his newfound alliance with Putin. And as stated, a successful Russian war against Ukraine might very well motivate China to attack Taiwan. But Biden has already warned that the United States will defend Taiwan if attacked. So figuring out how to deal with Russia and China at the same time will represent the biggest security issue facing the United States and its allies in the foreseeable future. If Washington cannot find an agreement with Russia in Europe, Moscow will almost certainly be pushed closer to Beijing in the long run, and that will present a major problem for American security. Okay, so that concludes my take on the current conflict in Ukraine.